All right, so let's get started, guys. We have a lot to cover in a short amount of time. So, welcome again to 635. For those of you all joining us on YouTube, my name is Drew Ayers, co-leader of 635 Ministries. Want to welcome you, and if you haven't already, go ahead and click the subscribe button. But because I know I'll forget. But today we're going to be discussing part 4 of our series that we've been going through called the Rescue Mission series. For those on YouTube, you can click on the top right of the video, and that will lead to an introduction video where we kind of give an overview of what the Rescue Mission teaching series is about. But today we're going to be talking about gender, and namely, is the modern concept of gender a reality that is within God's design and is biblically supported, or is it simply a human-made and non-biblical philosophy? Okay? So, let's go ahead and jump right into it. So again, the Rescue Mission series has been something that we've been doing over the past couple months, and it is intended to educate Christians like you all to be educated on these controversial topics that are commonly thought as political. But the Bible, as I hope to show, does speak authority and does have authority and speaks truth over those topics. And so we need to be educated on these topics because we're to be in the world but not of the world. And to tell people under these false worldviews about the truth. Because as we'll see, a non-biblical worldview is a very destructive, it's a very dark and depressing worldview. And so we've covered abortion, we've covered the design of biblical marriage, talked about same-sex relationships, and today we're going to be talking about gender. So I want to give an encouragement before we get started. As you all know, this is probably know, this is my number one rule, and all my presentations is to ask questions. I will pause after certain slides if you all want to ask questions. But there definitely will be a time at the end where if you want to save them till the end, that's fine too. And for those on YouTube, feel free to leave a comment down below, or there will be an email address if you want to send an email asking questions or make a comment on it. So I have this divided up into 5 sections. Section 1 is, I'm just going to give an introduction on what the secular world, the modern day culture, how it defines gender and gender philosophy. I think this is important because what's the number one rule in apologetics?
To win the soul, not the argument.
Yeah, to win the soul, not the argument. And so in order to do that, you kind of have to understand the worldview of where they're coming from. Else, you might be playing on the same field, but you're playing under 2 different sets of rules. So the example I always like to give is if you ask somebody, do you believe in God? Well, they may be thinking of God as a totally different God than what you think is God. And so they say, yeah, I believe in God, but they actually don't believe in what you define as God. So it's important to define terms and just come to an understanding of where they're coming from. Does that make sense? I think it leads to a lot better dialogue that way too. So we're going to just start off with a couple of definitions. I'm going to go through what I call secular definitions. Now, does anybody know what the word secular means? Secular ultimately means worldly or non-religious. It doesn't take into account, it doesn't have to consider what the Bible says or what any religious text says. It's non-religious. So you can think of it as worldly. Right? And so, oh, hey, come on in, Nathan. So, a secular definition of gender, as defined by the World Health Organization, is as follows. It says that gender refers to the characteristics of women, men, girls, and boys that are socially constructed. This includes norms, behaviors, and roles associated with being a woman, man, girl, or boy, as well as relationships with each other. And so this is the key point. As a social construct, gender varies from society to society and can change over time. So the main point here is that gender is a social construct. Now, what this means is that it is something that is defined by society at large. So, it doesn't necessarily have a inherent definition. Does that make sense? And so that can change over time. Perhaps as the definition of a man or a woman changes. That's what this implies. Okay? Now keep this in mind, because this is different than gender identity. So the Advocates for Trans Equality defines gender identity as follows. I won't read the whole thing. But it says gender identity and sexual orientation are two different things. Gender identity refers to your internal knowledge of your own gender. For example, your knowledge that you're a man, a woman, or another gender. Sexual orientation has to do with whom you're attracted to. Okay? Now, what does this mean? So I already defined gender as this social construct, that there are these societal definitions of a man and a woman, and your gender identity is how you perceive how you fit into those roles. Okay? Those norms, behaviors, etc. Even your physical characteristics, as we'll see. However, that's different than sexual orientation. So what this means is that you can't always assume that someone who says, I am a transgender man or I am a transgender woman is attracted sexually to a man or a woman. You can't always assume that according to the secular definition. Okay? And this is different than being gender nonconforming. All right, so to throw another term, they define gender nonconforming as meaning not conforming to gender stereotypes. For example, someone's clothes, hairstyle, speech patterns, or hobbies might be considered more feminine or more masculine than what's stereotypically associated with another gender. Okay, so it's a little bit different than gender identity. Now, to sum this up, I kind of have I know that can be confusing. I have a summary of definitions here. So whenever the secular world uses these, defines sex, it says that it is the characteristics defined by your biological and physiological characteristics. All right, so that goes into things like hormone levels, reproductive organs, how many chromosomes you have, or your sex chromosomes, etc. Right, that is sex. However, that's different than sexual orientation, which means who you're simply sexually attracted to. Now, this is independent of everything else. Okay? But gender is norms, behaviors, and other characteristics of men and women that are these social constructs. That means that they're defined by society and they can change with society. Okay? Gender identity is your psychological perception of which gender you belong to. And gender nonconforming is you behave in a different way than stereotypes.
I'd like to argue something.
All right, comment.
Based on the way I've heard it explained by other people who practice this stuff, gender identity is more so the behaviors and the style that you already have and which gender you believe that fits into, and then
Yes.
you fit into that, rather than like the psychological. Like, I don't know, maybe it's just the way that you said it, but like instead of thinking that somebody belongs in that gender group,
Mm-hmm.
it's rather just the behaviors and things that they already do that they believe put them in there.
Yes. It's that, and that goes back to the definition of gender. It's these norms, behaviors, and other characteristics of men and women that are social constructs. But if you have a gender identity, it's how you perceive your gender. It's the psychological perception of the gender. It's your psychological perception of your norms and behaviors and how you fit into those social constructs. I think we're saying the same thing.
Yeah.
It's their behaviors, but it's how they perceive their behaviors and how they fit into society at large. Society at large is social constructs of man and woman. Okay? I guess by psychological I mean more mental. It's the mental perception.
Okay.
Yes. And so we have to have a basic understanding of these terms whenever we're talking with people. And this leads to the definition of being transgender. And this will be probably more of the focus of this presentation, but I think that the concepts covered speak to the gender, what the word gender means as a whole. I do think it does, but I think specifically this presentation more discusses transgender ideas and ideology. But anyway, a definition that's given is transgender people are people whose gender identity is different from the gender they were thought to be at birth. And I added emphasis on those terms there. So basically, if you are born and a doctor either does a sex chromosome test or they look at your reproductive organs and they say this person is a male, a transgender person would say, I am not a male. I am something different. Okay? That's the definition of transgender. And essentially this implies that your body's characteristics do not matter. It is how you perceive yourself that matters as far as your gender. Okay? Now this is a key point. This is a key point. Your body's characteristics do not matter. It is how you perceive yourself that matters. So moreover, let's look back at the definitions more closely. Okay? Now I've highlighted these in red. Gender identity refers to your internal knowledge, ... For example, your knowledge that you're a man. Okay? Here's a couple other definitions I saw, a couple more quotes. It says, some people's gender identity, their innate knowledge of who they are, is different from what was initially expected when they were born. Okay? And then here's another different definition. People can realize they're transgender at any age. They just knew. Others may need more time to realize that they are transgender. So what ultimately this implies is the third point on this slide. So here's just a summary here. Gender is a social construct that is related to biological sex. Gender identity is how your mind psychologically perceives your gender. But then here's the point, here's the reason why I had all those quotes in red. Is that your gender identity is an ingrained, inherent, and I'm going to use a big word, ontological. That means it is built into your essence of who you are. And therefore, it is, I've heard this described as your true self. Like, I have found my true self. Whenever a person says that they want to stop being a man and be a woman, they said, that's my true self. Okay? It's built into them. And so therefore, to go against this is to go against both science and, if you're religious, the Creator, because does not the psalmist say, you formed my inward parts, you knew me in the womb. You knitted me together, I am fearfully and wonderfully made. And this is why it's important for Christians. Because if we are saying that this ideology is wrong, especially transgender ideology, if we're saying that's wrong, then we're guilty of saying God's design is wrong. And we're guilty of calling God a liar. That's why this is so important for us. Okay? Now, I'm not saying, first of all, to make it clear that I'm agreeing with all these points. I'm not disagreeing with all these points. I'm going to make the case in the following sections, but this gives us a good, I think, primer, introduction to these terms and understanding of the modern concept of what is gender. Okay? Clear? Now? Oh, question?
So, are you saying that, for a little bit of clarification, that when God knew us, made us, that he knew that people would be transgender, and that was part of his plan.
That's what I'm saying that the modern concept says. Because, look, you see that, if I go back a slide, it says that others may need more time to realize that they are, their innate knowledge of who they are. I've heard it described as your true self. And so therefore, if it is a good part, it's a part of God's design, then yes. And we have to look at, is this a part of God's design, or is this something that humans have made up? That's what I'm trying to look at. But the modern concept of it seems to imply, and I've heard this a lot from people who advocate for the secular definitions and say they're Christians, as they say, I am fearfully and wonderfully made. They quote Psalm 139. All right, so that's why I say it's important. I'm going to examine that view, is what I'm going to do, Nathan. Good question. All right, one more thing. One more thing before I go on is I want to present this graph. We're going to come back to it, or present this table here. Is if you look in the right, this is a Gallup poll from 2021, and it says that among all U.S. adults, 0.7% say that they are transgender, and 0.3% say that they are something other. That could be queer, same-gender loving, gender non-conforming, etc. And so if you look at how many adults are in the U.S., and 0.7% of those say they're transgender, this means that 1.8 million adults say their identity is transgender, and 775,000 say other. And the reason I say this is I actually heard someone say that this isn't really that big of an issue, but I think it is, because that's a lot of people. And what's more is that if you look at the same Gallup poll, now Gallup is probably pretty unbiased, I would say, but if you look at the Gallup poll, this is like on the leftmost column you have the different generations. So you have baby boomers, Generation X, millennials, Generation Z at the top. You can look at, say, in 1950, 0.2% would have said they were transgender, and now among Generation Z, that number goes up to 2.1%. Among those that say the other, that's 1.2% in the Generation Z. And so if you compare that to the total 0.7, 0.3% among U.S. adults, that proportion is a lot higher among Generation Z, our generation. That's a lot higher than it is. Okay? And this kind of makes sense with the secular definitions a little bit. I think that if you have a definition where gender varies over time, it's a social construct, it can vary from society to society, and you depart from what maybe the Bible says, then you would have more people saying, oh, okay, then I don't have to live in accordance with the Bible. Yes, Nathan.
Would it be possible it's just on the rise because of two things, really? One of those things being at first being classified as gender dysphoria, not being transgender, and no longer being classified as gender dysphoria. It's not, I don't believe it's in the DSM-5. I know it's 4.
Yeah.
Don't believe this is the 5. And then also, could it be that the same amount of people felt that way, they just weren't able to be open about the way they felt in the time period that they were alive? Because I don't know. And the only reason I say this is because you hear it a lot, especially in the church, that times are worse now than they ever were.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yes.
I would make the argument that sin has always been prevalent since the fall of man. I mean, at one point, God smited 2 cities. He flooded the earth at one point. Like I I don't think it's any worse now than it was before.
Yeah.
It's just society has changed for people to be more in that open about it. But yet there was probably still individuals in those generations, the boomers, the Gen Xers, and so on, that felt that way and just weren't able to outwardly show it.
Yeah. It's possible. I don't know exactly what the survey questions were or anything like that.
And it's
Well,
a hard thing to gauge on survey.
it is. But I think if you actually look at some of the statistics, even this trend is also common among people who say they're lesbian, gay, and bisexual. So the same argument could be made there too. I mean, maybe back then they didn't just openly express it, maybe due to some social stigma. That's possible. But I can't answer that question. We will talk about gender dysphoria here in a little bit. So that might answer your question a little better. So any other questions? Okay. So section 2. The science of the modern concept of gender. All right. Now I put science in quotes here because not as a mockery. I'm not mocking science. Okay, but I put it in quotes for a reason that I present at the end of this section. Okay, so try to pay attention because I think we come to a very profound point, not just in this topic, but in almost any topic. Okay. So again, if we look at a summary of the modern concept, again, point number 3 asserts, it says that your gender identity is an ingrained, inherent part of who you are. It is your true self. Ultimately, it's a part of the very good creation that God made you to be. All right, that's the modern synthesis that we're going to test. And but see, every worldview, every way that you view the world, and this is what I was trying to say whenever I was talking about the Trinity. How you view God has profound impact on how you live your life. Because if this is your true self, and this is an inherent part of who you are, then you're going to live in accordance with that. And so some of the results that often come of this is changing your body to conform to what your mind says. Got it? All right. So, because that's a key point. And so some non-surgical things that come about as a result of this are things like laser hair removal, masculinizing hormone replacement, feminizing hormone therapy, voice and communication therapy. So that's where you're trying to change a person's voice pitch and tone and how they pronounce words, etc. Reproductive counseling. This is actually interesting. Is that whenever I was reading up on this on the WebMD, it said that quote hormone therapy can limit your fertility. Right, it can make you infertile, and you need to be counseled before you make that transition. All right, you need to be aware of that. So they already acknowledged that there is a very high risk of being infertile as a result of this. Okay, now keep that in mind. Keep that point in mind. Okay. 2, mental health care. WebMD says, quote, you face many issues when you establish a new gender identity. Should you get sex reassignment surgery? How do you prepare mentally? How do you deal socially with the transition? About family, health, and support systems. And you need a mental health specialist to help you explore these different approaches. So they kind of understand also that these things can be mentally taxing, right? Probably one of the ones that is most controversial is puberty blockers, things that you take to try to delay puberty within you, and that can be for a whole host of reasons. Maybe you are like a kid and a pre-adolescent, you don't want to become a man, so you take puberty blockers to try to delay that. And that has its own effects, as you can imagine. But here are some more of the results of it. Surgical. And this is some of the more involved stuff, such as facial reconstruction surgery. So you're going to have injections in your cheekbone, reshape your face, bone reconstruction, which can be pretty intense, as you can believe. Chest and breast surgery. It said that it changed the appearance, not the functionality, but I question that, especially with the previous comment that it can limit your fertility, so it could limit also your ability to like breastfeed and do things like that. I mean, you're removing breast tissue, so I don't see how that could help with any breastfeeding, you know what I mean? So it could have permanent impacts on that. And the most common one or at least the most controversial and debated, is gender reassignment surgery, where they actually quote, transform and rebuild your genitals to come as close as possible in appearance and function to those of your gender identity. Now, this is some pretty involved stuff. Now, but note that this is ultimately changing the body to come into conformance with your thinking, how you perceive yourself. Okay? That's big. It's a big key. That's a big point that's going to come up later. Got it? So a question I want to ask is, well, if you're changing your body, then you must think it's an inherent characteristic. So I want to challenge that, because that was one of the questions. Because if we go back to the 3 points, it's an inherent part of who you're created to be. And it has these results, and so I want to challenge that. I want to test that. And so this is from a CNN article, and this psychologist, who's a, quote, expert in this, says, kids don't make stuff up about this, wanting to become trans because it's trendy or something like that. All right? And so basically what they're pushing back against is it's not a cultural phenomenon that we're seeing in modern times. But I say, now wait a minute. If this is true, then how do you explain these statistics? I say within 70 years, you have probably close to 2 million people now coming out and saying that they are transgender. And you have 0.1% to 1.2% within generations saying that there's something else. Now, if this was the case, why didn't this occur earlier? And it kind of goes back to your point, well, maybe they weren't wanting to actually share their inherent identity, but I honestly don't know why this hasn't occurred in the past 250 years of America, or even in other parts of the world, as we'll see later. So I kind of have to question, it's not a trend. I have to question that just a little bit. So what does science say? Science says that when someone needs this care, this is also this is from the American Academy of Pediatrics. It says when someone needs this care, it really depends on the person. Some children have a sense about their true gender as early as 3 years old. All right, so whenever I said that I've heard it a lot as their true self, this is one of those places where you see that, where they see that claim made. It's their true gender. And this is what the experts say, and others as they move into puberty, and still others much later. So it's not a trend. They're saying it's not trendy, right? That's what they're saying. But I also say, okay, but wait. I said, so the scientists have spoken. I'm like, well, another scientist, it says a psychiatrist who is, this is from the New York Times actually. It says a psychiatrist who has presided over youth gender transition treatments for more than a decade says, quote, 4 out of 5 gender questioning children eventually accept their bodies if no medical interventions are carried out. I've heard the same statistic quoted in a lot of other places as being between 80 and 90%. 80 and 90%. And this is not all children. This is just the gender questioning children. So if they question it and they're left, 80 to 90% will come back to what their bodies tell them. Okay? Now, that's two totally different conclusions by two different experts. All right? So I have to ask, does science prove that gender is an inherent part of us? So I ask another question. Is it good for their health? Because God wants us to be in good health, right? And so the World Professional Association for Transgender Health's guidelines, they say that this gender-affirming care should be a way for people to create, quote, effective pathways to achieving lasting personal comfort with their gendered selves. Notice they didn't say bodies. Okay? It says it is to maximize their overall health and self-fulfillment. All right? They go on to say that it builds self-esteem, improves overall quality of life. But what do they say in the next paragraph? And although they're at higher risk of mental health issues, not all transgender or non-binary youth have them. If they do, they don't have to struggle with these issues for life if they can get the right treatment. Now notice what they said there. They said that they have a higher proportion of mental health issues. Okay? And so I asked the further question, why are there mental health problems? And the CNN article says, explanation 1, that it stems from marginalization, discrimination, and bullying from society because of their gender. Now that seems like a very good claim. It seems reasonable, doesn't it? Would you all agree? It seems reasonable. I mean, if you're bullied, then yeah, you're going to have mental health issues. However, I'm like, okay, well, let me look at a progressive country. Let me look at a country where this is openly affirmed. And so I looked at Finland. LGBT rights in Finland are among the most advanced in the world. Right? And I looked it up, not just on the Wikipedia article, but on a pro-transgender website, and it is almost twice as high as the average score in Europe. It is a very progressive country. However, and you can't see this, but I'll read it, there was another psychiatrist who said that she actually had multiple studies that back this up, said that this group's higher suicide rate was tied to the fact that they had a higher rate of severe psychiatric problems, not to their gender distress. And what they were doing was looking at, well, hold up a second. Are their mental health problems a part of them being bullied because they are transgender? Or is it because of pre-existing mental health conditions? Does that make sense? So explanation 1 says that it's a result of societal discrimination. And number 2 says that the higher rate of suicide was attributed to pre-existing mental health problems. And the conclusion from this is that gender dysphoria, the implication of explanation 2 is that gender dysphoria is a result of pre-existing mental health issues. And that's what they're saying. And think about it. Your endocrine system produces all the hormones that regulate mood, regular bodily functions, etc. And if you throw this off, don't you throw off like your mood? Remember those masculinizing hormone therapy and the feminizing hormone therapy I was talking about? Yeah, wouldn't that throw out your whole endocrine system and stuff like that?
Yeah, I know someone who's currently going through hormone replacement therapy.
Yeah.
And it's transitioned from female to male. And in their transition, they've said that they felt a lot angrier.
All right, hold that thought. So I looked up a study. So I looked at this study. This is about the largest study I could find. There was a group of researchers, of American researchers, I think I can't remember exactly where they were. The link is there. They surveyed over 18 million men, 17.8 which were not on testosterone, like as a supplement, and about 264,000 who were. And what they found was that men who use testosterone should be screened for and counseled about risks of depression and suicidality. Testosterone use is independently associated with new onset mental health disorders. And this number right here, actually, if you've taken a statistics class, that P less than 0.0001, that means that there is a 0.01% chance that they have assumed a conclusion as true, but it was really false. Meaning they're saying there's a 0.01% chance that they say that there's a difference between the two groups, but there's really not. That's a very low percentage. There's a 0.01% chance that they're wrong, is essentially what they're saying. And that's very strong. Now, how does this pertain to it? There you go. Is that if there are these pre-existing mental health conditions that cause gender dysphoria, and you take masculinizing hormones, say, that only makes the mental health condition worse. And so my point is that we look at the same data, but who is right? Which explanation is right? And therefore science can't help us. Hence the section title. We look at the same data, but science, whenever you interpret the evidence, you can interpret it different ways. Does that make sense? So you could say that, well, say that these mental health issues are caused by society, or they're caused by these underlying mental health issues like depression, anxiety, and trauma. Who's right? And so my point is that we need to go back to Scripture. And we need to go back to what God has to say about it. Does that make sense? Does that make sense? Because this has massive implications for whenever you're discussing evolution. How so? Think of like, if I look at the same fossil record, someone interprets that as millions of years of evolution. Others interpret that as a catastrophic flood where when the fountains of the great deep burst forth, the marine fossils, like the trilobites, were fossilized in graveyards and therefore are at the bottom, and then dinosaurs who were on land and migrated to higher land were fossilized later. See the two different interpretations? Same data, same evidence. Therefore, it's really hard for science to really help us, especially in this matter. So here's the questions we must face. Does the Bible say there's a difference between gender and sex? Is all this modern concept biblically supported? And really, is it loving to affirm or not to affirm one's inherent gender identity? Right? And so we're going to answer those questions in the next section. So what does the Bible have to say about all this? Well, in the beginning. Anybody recognize this slide? Yeah. Yeah, it's from the previous two presentations, right? And so we talked about in Genesis chapter 1, verses 26 through 28, God says, so God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him. Male and female he created them. And so I want to ask a fourth point. These 3 points were all covered in the previous one. But a fourth point is, how did God assign Adam and Eve's genders? Did he do it with or without their input? Or maybe gender was meant to come from what our bodies tell us. Now you may say, well, again, Old Testament, doesn't matter. I love Jesus. I love what Jesus preached love. He preached affirmation. Right? Well, let's see what Jesus had to say about it. Oh boy. He quotes the same verse. He says, he's talking about divorce in Matthew 19, but he says, have you not read that he who created them from the beginning made them male and female, and said, therefore a man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. Now he's talking about marriage, but he also talks about the creation of male and female. Now, trivia question. This is an autobiography right here because Jesus is the one who created them. John 1:3. All things came into being through him. So whenever he says he who created them made them male and female, he's talking about himself. So I think he would know what he's talking about. Right? And so my point is, again, is how did Jesus assign Adam and Eve's genders? Did Jesus do it without their input? Or maybe gender was meant to come from what our bodies tell us? So, as always, there's objections to this. So objection one, and this is the main one. I think the rest are kind of center around this one, really. There can be an objection made that your argument is one from silence because maybe Adam and Eve were transgender. God intended for creation to be a place where love reigned and people would not be ashamed of who they are. Pretty powerful argument, it seems like, right? But let me ask this. I'll ask this. I'm going to address the question of, is specifically transgender ideology, is this God designed? And I think this is where we get really into the bones of it. The meat and potatoes, as some people say. Imagine a world. All right, now really focus here, because when I first realized this, it really struck me. Imagine a world where anorexia. So, do you all know what anorexia is? Okay. Imagine a world where anorexia and body dysmorphia. You know what? Everybody knows what body dysmorphia is? Okay. Imagine where this was affirmed as good. If someone was anorexic, you said, yes, you shouldn't eat anything. You're fat. You should lose weight. You should starve yourself. And let me ask this question. Is this God's design? Am I not loving them by affirming who they are? Because apparently they're fat. Right? And so they need to lose weight. But this person is already starving themselves. And so do I affirm that? Are we going to affirm and support people as they do this? No, I really, really hope that everybody here and everybody on YouTube is saying no to this. Because it is estimated that about, I think it was 7.4 million people will have some form of anorexia in their lifetimes. Now, how does this pertain to the gender argument? Is that what is happening is their bodies are, and I have a typo here. I had a typo I corrected on the first slide, but not on this one, just FYI. Imagine a world where everybody was transgender. Okay? Well, actually, let me go back to the first point here. I kind of was running ahead of myself there. Is that if you have your body that's designed with a purpose, and yet your mind perceives something else, and you go about changing your body to conform to your mind, I think it's like anorexia and body dysmorphia. I think it is like that. Right? Now imagine a world where everybody was transgender. Because if it's in God's design, then if everybody was transgender, it'd be good. Right? Because God's design is perfectly good. Does that not make sense? However, this is impossible, actually. It is impossible for everyone to be transgender. Okay? Let me try to explain. I'm going to give, I think, I'm going to make three arguments from this. Okay? The second one's probably the most important. I'm going to try to make three arguments from this. Okay? I'm going to try to address this from three different viewpoints, but they all lead to the same conclusion. Imagine, so being transgender is whenever you're assigned a gender at birth and then you change it later in life. Now, on your modern day birth certificates, you don't have to fill that out. Okay? Because you cannot tell what gender a baby is by their bodily characteristics. Okay? Now, if that never happens, therefore a doctor never is able to assign a gender at birth, then you can't transition away from that later in life. Does that make sense? A little bit. And so therefore, it'd be impossible for everybody to be transgender. Because transgender thought is saying you shouldn't assign somebody's gender at birth. And therefore, if it's not assigned at birth, then you can't be transgender because you never had a starting point to work with. I'm going to explain it a different way, and this is the main point, okay? So if we go back to the definition, it says gender refers to the characteristics of women, men, girls, and boys that are socially constructed. Now, I'm not making this up. I'm not a theologian, I'm not a professor, but when I read that, I had to scratch my head. Because I asked, well, wait a sec. Pause here. So, if I had to talk with the World Health Organization, I would ask this question. I would say, so you say that gender refers to the characteristics of men and norms of being a man, but how did you define man in the first place? Okay, let that sink in a little bit.
I saw a video on that recently.
Really?
It was very.
But
it was from a while, like a few years ago, but the fact that it's so accurate these days is crazy.
yeah. And this is something called circular reasoning. I'm going to try to explain it. Okay. So let me try to explain this. This is like that fourth question in the intro video. I'm having trouble here. Okay. So gender is defined as referring to these characteristics of men, women, girls, and boys that are socially constructed. My question is, how did those social constructs, what are those social constructs built off of? And historically, they're built off of being a woman, man, girl, or boy. But the question I ask is, well, then what is gender? Because if there are these definitions of being a man and a woman that are rooted historically in your biological makeup and how you perceive your gender, but now you're saying that doesn't matter, then gender can't exist. Because gender is based upon the behaviors and roles associated with being a woman, man, girl, or boy. So for this modern concept of gender to come into existence, it has to presuppose a definition of man and woman in society in order to come up with those social constructs. Does that make sense? I'm gonna give it an analogy. Imagine there is this foundation. There's this foundation that defines a man and a woman based on what your body tells you. This gender ideology tries to build off that foundation and says, no, that doesn't matter. I can interpret the definitions of man and woman as to however I want it to be. But at the same time, they're trying to kick out the foundation from under them of the definitions of a man and a woman. Does that make sense? So building the foundation. So say there's this foundation historically of man and woman being your biological characteristics. And then this modern idea, gender, says, hold up. Gender is just a social construct. There's no real definition of a man or a woman. And so it tries to kick the foundation from under it that it built itself off of. And so that's why I think eventually this whole movement is going to self-destruct. Because I don't know if there is going to be even a definition of gender if you throw the words man and woman out of the vocabulary of the English language. That's what it's trying to do. Now that's a very hard concept, and if you have confusion, I encourage you to rewatch the video. But I think it's something for us to think about is as a future, just of our nation. Is if this continues to play out, where is this going? Where is this going really, right? And the reason I say it's circular reasoning, the implications of that is it can't affirm itself. The reasoning can't affirm itself. But let me ask this. Love reigned and people would not be ashamed. Let me ask this. Instead of changing our bodies to conform to our thinking, why do we not change our thinking to conform to our body? In other words, why do we not love our body instead? Does that make sense? So instead of changing, and dare I say, mutilating our bodies to come into conformance with our mind, why don't we understand that maybe our thinking is not right and change our thinking to conform to what our body tells us? Okay? I think if there's anything, I know it's in the middle of the presentation, but if there was somebody who said they were transgender, I would ask them that question. That's what I would ask them. I would ask them, why do you not love your body? That's what I would ask them. If somebody came up to me and said that, I would just do that. I would do that. So, if anything, memorize this. All right, I'm going to kind of skim through these next ones. So the Bible doesn't outright speak against transgender ideology. The word transgender is not in the Bible. That's a pretty weak argument, really, because maybe it indicates that the idea of being transgender is a pretty new idea. You know, maybe it didn't exist in the Bible. It wasn't necessarily a thing that the Jews or even Jesus himself considered as true. I mean, and the reason, and I say this not just of my own bias, but simply from Genesis 1 and Matthew chapter 19. Silence also doesn't mean affirmation. It doesn't mean prohibition, I'll give it that, but it doesn't mean affirmation. And then you have prescription versus description. Namely, I think that the Bible speaks prescriptively on this issue, and that it outlines principles and concepts that show that, or affirm that gender is meant to come from what our bodies tell us. So objection 3, you can look over this, you can research these last two later, but I've heard this a lot. Joseph in Genesis 37, the man with the water in Mark 14, and the eunuchs in Matthew 19 were transgender. I should have put or queer on here because that sometimes gets thrown around too. Some people argue that early Jewish commentators, you can go back and read this, I'll send these out. Some argue that early Jewish commentators in 300 to 500 AD said that Joseph pencils his eyes, lifts his heel, curls his hair, twirling and hugging himself. He behaves in this, they don't say he behaves in a feminine manner, but he kind of acts like it a little bit. Yeah. And then he goes on to say that there are these people, these Jewish commentators say that, yeah, there were these women who were trying to charm Joseph and throw bracelets at him and get him to basically, I guess, try to seduce him, but he wouldn't even look at them. And so they kind of assume that he wasn't attracted to women. They also cite his coat of many colors. And that it's the same coat used, and the same word used in 2 Samuel to refer to these virgin daughters, or the robes that the virgin daughters of the king wore. And so they basically try to say that Joseph was queer. That's what they try to say. But first of all, I'm going to put this out there. One, the Midrash is not scripture. There is actually an earlier Pharisee, Josephus. He mentions that, yes, Joseph was, quote, beautiful in body, and we're going to see where that comes from. But his brothers killed him because of jealousy, not because they were homophobic or transphobic or anything like that. They killed him because of jealousy. There was no mention of him they killed him because he was queer. And moreover, the Jews believed in the Old Testament law. So Deuteronomy 22:5 was a prohibition against cross-dressing. And so if Joseph was indeed wearing this robe as a signifier of his femininity, then then they would not have held Joseph in such a high regard. Yeah. See an enemy, yeah. But let's look at the text of Joseph 39, right? So when Joseph was a servant to a guy named Potiphar, his wife, what? Okay. His wife, Potiphar's wife, it says, after a time, his master's wife cast her eyes on Joseph and said, lie with me. But he refused and said to his master's wife, behold, because of me, my master has no concern about anything in the house. And he basically ends up saying, how then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God? He didn't have sex with Potiphar's wife and lay with her. He didn't do that because he was queer or anything. He did it because he didn't want to sin against God. And what's more is that if you compare this with Genesis 38, the author of Genesis obviously looked at him as a man of high sexual integrity. Moreover, he becomes married eventually. No, Asenath, which was a priestess of On, an Egyptian. And of course he wouldn't look at other women. What's more is that if you read the rest of that Midrashic passage where he didn't look at women, he is praised by God eventually for his obedience. He's praised for his obedience. And what's more, yes, he was married and he had 2 sons. So this interpretation of Joseph being necessarily queer and transgender and stuff like that, that's not really spoken by the text, really, when you look at it, when you look at Joseph's life. And I think this brings up a good point, is that just because someone acts a certain way doesn't mean that they deny what their created bodies tell them. Just because that someone may be more loving or more gentle or humble or anything like that, that doesn't mean that they would say that they're a man when they're female, or rather the opposite, because normally females are thought as more emotional and loving. Paul said, rejoice with those who rejoice and weep with those who weep. So what about intersex people? Does this not show that transgender is in God's design? It's another objection. And I ask, exactly, what about intersex people? Because what the transgender ideology is saying, what they're saying is that it doesn't matter what your body tells you. It doesn't matter. And all that matters is how you perceive yourself. So why would they care about when someone may be born intersex and have partially formed genitalia of both genders? It doesn't really affirm transgender ideology, because it doesn't matter what your body tells you. And what's sad about this is most intersex people have these debilitating diseases. They're not good. They're very harmful. They really are. And I think that Christians should see intersex people as longing for the redemption of their bodies. It's a part of our fallen nature. It's the effects of sin and the curse of sin. I think that's how we should see intersex people, and not as an affirmation of transgender ideology. That's not how we should approach this issue. So, and I actually saw, I think I forget what it's called. It's like the National Society of Intersex People. They were really hurt by how the transgender community was used. I've heard people really say how they're hurt by the transgender community affirming their ideology because people in the intersex community, kind of. In Galatians 3:28 says there is no male or female. Since we're kind of running short on time, I'm just going to kind of say that what this is referring to is that there's no division within Christ's body. Not necessarily that there's no male and female on this earth, because he's talking about there's neither slave nor free. He's talking about how there's no real divisions within the body, and there's equality in right standing before God. And then when you realize there's equality, then you realize that there is no one's really better than anybody else. That's what he's kind of saying, right? You don't have to be jealous. And I think that's a beautiful passage to show that the Bible is not anti-women. It's not misogynistic whenever you read passages like this. So how does the church respond? And I think that partially you have to understand the fall in our corrupted heart, and I want to focus on this. Paul says in Romans 7, "For I know that nothing good dwells in me, that is in my flesh. Wretched man that I am, who will deliver me from this body of death? Thanks be to God through Jesus Christ our Lord." Jeremiah says the heart is deceitful above all things and desperately sick. And what all this means is that our flesh is sick with the disease of sin. Every desire that comes from here, we cannot trust it as good. And that's the thing with things like guilt. Guilt over past sins. Think of it that way. Do you feel guilty over things you've done in the past? Of course. But the Bible says you're forgiven. And we need to be in that fact. But our bodies, and even Satan himself, our flesh says, you need to pay for those sins. Right? And so we cannot trust every single desire as good. Now, how does this have implications? Is that, you remember when I talked about how the transgender community tries to conform their body to their minds? The Bible says, transform your minds to conform with your body and understand your created body. Understand that. And the church should respond with endurance. So we're to never repay anyone with evil. This is, if I'm quite honest, this is a very angry. A lot of them I've talked to that belong to the LGBTQ community, they get very angry whenever I bring it up, and I'm trying to help them because I understand that what they're doing is going down a dark path. But we're always to seek to do good to one another. Compassion. With truth. 1 Corinthians 13 is a love passage. It says, love does not rejoice at wrongdoing, but rejoices with the truth. Right? And the truth is that God, in the beginning, God made them male and female. It comes from understanding our fallen nature. Because someone can ask, well, if God, why did God make me this way? God really should have made me a girl. He should have made me this way. I'm like, well, no, you have to understand your fallen nature and that your heart is deceitful. And it's desperately sick. Who can understand it? And so our minds need to be renewed by the Word and by the Holy Spirit. That's how I would respond to that. And more with love. And I end with these last slides. I do affirm Jesus' command that you love your neighbor as yourself, because I am not going to let them go down a destructive path, but I'm going to tell them to go along the right path. That's me loving my neighbor as myself. Because I wouldn't destroy my body, why would I let them destroy theirs? I do love my neighbor as I do myself. And yeah, I'm not going to let them go down a destructive path because it's been shown that people in this community have higher rates of suicide, right? So what about school teachers? Because I know that we had 2 school teachers here, and I wanted to address this. Recall the secular definitions. You remember how gender identity was different than sexual orientation? Now, what does this imply? Is that yes, you can. So by their own admission, you could have a person who says they should be treated like a female and use these female bathrooms, but they are sexually attracted to females still. Now let that sink in. So you have a female, or a person who says they're a female, they take these hormones to try to conform their body, go undergo surgery maybe, but they're still sexually attracted to females within a bathroom, in a locker room. Now think on that, okay? And there have been instances where this has led to really, really catastrophic consequences. And there are many who have opposed it in a loving way. This guy is from the UK. I read this article. Great testimony. He says, this guy said, every teacher is at risk if they share their beliefs and views in the classroom. He says, I believe affirming children in our transgender identity in the classroom is psychologically damaging for them. I refuse to go against my Christian faith and conscience and cause a child harm. No, he's not being bigoted and saying my way is the right way. I'm the Christian and I am a part of an oppressive religion that's just going to oppress people. No, he is a sincere Christian who sincerely believes in what he believes in because he doesn't want to harm them. He doesn't want them to go and end up mutilating their bodies. That's love. That's love. And I think that if you're a school teacher out there, you need to ask, what am I going to do? Do I affirm or do I affirm? That is, do I affirm their thinking or do I affirm their body? What God says. Right? So I don't think that you should feel guilty ever if you say to a person, why do you think? Like if a person came up and said, call me he, him, or she, her, I would ask, what does your body say to call you? That's what I would say. And then I would say, have you ever heard about, I would point them to Jesus as well, to show them that God created them for a purpose, and that God loves their body. God wanted them to love their body. I would tell them that. I love this quote, truth without love is hardness of heart, but love without truth is softness of head also. And so the rescue mission, yes, is that these people are suffering. They're suffering from these false worldviews. And we as Christians need to ask, what are we going to do? Because I think that people really become transgender. This is a testimony I saw in a magazine. It's by a girl, his name was Chloe Cole. And she wanted to become a man. And she says, throughout her childhood, Cole had a hard time fitting in. As the tomboyish type, it was difficult for her to socialize with her peers, especially women and other girls. She said one day she was introduced to the trans community and immediately felt a connection. And she said, it gave me a sense of hope that there was an explanation for why I felt different. And so what they were basically saying, she felt loved. And I think that the church should also strive to portray and imitate that love. And so conclusions, I'm just going to list them all here, is that God's design for sexuality is intended to be between a male and a female within the confines of the one flesh union we call marriage. The Bible is clear that today's modern concept of gender is really a human-made philosophical construct. It can't really even support itself reasonably. And I think that I push back against the part of the modern-day concept of gender that says that it is separate from what your body says. It doesn't matter what your body says, really. Or it has a very minimal influence. It is not a part of the very good created order intended by God, and also the scientific evidence and statistics really show that it is psychologically damaging to them, and that we really need to address the underlying mental health problems other than affirming those mental health problems more. And the last part is that our identity is the bride of Christ, the church. And this is what we look forward to. So with that, thank you all for joining. I know that was a little bit long. Here are a couple of resources. I do have these two books if you all would like to read those. If anybody has if anybody has any questions, we're just going to have a little bit of a Q&A time here, or you can send an email. And for those on YouTube, just want to say thanks for watching, or thanks for listening if you're driving. Join us next time for this. Next time we'll be discussing part 5 of this on, quote, racism, why race is not in God's vocabulary, which seems to be very, you may be scratching your heads, but I hope that becomes pretty clear in the next presentation. So leave a comment, leave a like, subscribe, turn on the notifications buttons, and the whole shebang. And we'll see you next time. Thanks for watching.